At 7:42 a.m. on October 15, 2023, Kevin Hartman was standing alone in a soybean field just outside Eldora, Iowa, staring at a machine that refused to listen to him. And there was nothing dramatic about the moment at first glance. No shouting, no frantic phone calls, no one running, just a quiet, almost awkward stillness as he rested one boot on the ladder of a John Deere S780 and looked at the screen glowing back at him from inside the cab. The kind of glow that doesn't ask questions or care who you are. It just tells you something isn't allowed to happen. And the message was simple enough if you stripped away the language of software and engineering. The header wouldn't lift. The machine had decided that today, at least for now, harvesting was not going to be an option. Kevin didn't swear. He didn't slam the door. He just stood there longer than most people would. The way someone does when they're replaying numbers in their head instead of words. Because this wasn't a small inconvenience, and he knew it immediately. He had 640 acres of soybeans standing in front of him. Beans that had hit 13% moisture almost perfectly. The kind of number you don't argue with. The kind you wait all season for, and the forecast on his phone, which he had already checked twice before climbing into the cab that morning, showed rain moving in late Friday, the kind of slow, steady rain that doesn't look dangerous until it's already too late. Because by Monday those beans wouldn't be 13% anymore. They'd be 15, maybe 16. And anyone who's been around a harvest long enough knows exactly what that means without having to spell it out. It means drying costs. It means weight loss. It means pods that start to shatter if the wind comes up at the wrong time. And it means the difference between breaking even and losing money on a crop you've been babysitting since May. Kevin was 62 years old that fall. Third generation on the same ground. The kind of farmer who doesn't talk much about the years because the land already knows them. And he was wearing the same brown Carhartt jacket he'd bought back in 2003. The cuffs frayed just enough that you could tell it had earned its place. And if you looked closely, you'd notice his hands resting on the ladder rung weren't shaking. Not because the situation wasn't serious, but because he'd learned a long time ago that panic never fixed anything with iron involved. He climbed back down, walked around the front of the combine, checked the header one more time even though he already knew what he was going to see. Everything physically fine, nothing bent, nothing leaking. Nothing you could point to and say that's it. That's the problem. And that was the problem. When he called the dealer, he didn't dress it up. He gave them the code. Explained what the machine was doing. Waited through the familiar pause on the other end while someone pulled up a screen somewhere else. And when the answer came back, it sounded polite and professional and completely useless to the situation on the ground. They'd need to send a technician with the software, minimum 3 days. Probably Thursday afternoon if everything lined up. 3 days. Kevin said thank you, because that's what you say. Even when the words don't help, and he ended the call and stood there again. This time looking past the machine, across the field. The beans standing clean and ready, the kind of crop that almost feels like it's holding its breath with you. Waiting for the first pass of the header. There's a particular weight that settles in when you realize time is no longer something you control. And Kevin felt it then, not as fear exactly. More like a tightening. The awareness that the calendar and the weather and a piece of software were now in the conversation, whether he liked it or not. He walked back toward the machine shed with a pace that didn't look rushed, but wasn't casual either. A steady, deliberate stride. The kind you see in someone who's already moving past the bad news and into the part where decisions have to be made. Because standing around feeling wronged doesn't dry beans or stop rain. Before we go any further, it's worth understanding that what happened next wasn't a lucky guess or a nostalgic impulse. It wasn't a man clinging to the past because he didn't understand the present. Kevin Hartman isn't against technology. He plants with GPS. He studies yield maps. He knows exactly what that S780 is capable of when everything works the way it's supposed to. And when it's running right, it can chew through 300 acres a day without breaking a sweat, adjusting itself dozens of times a second, measuring losses you can't see, turning data into decisions faster than any human ever could. But that morning, it wasn't running right. And more importantly, it wasn't running at all. And the reasons for that were locked behind things Kevin didn't have access to, couldn't override, and wasn't allowed to touch. No matter how well he understood the machine itself. The shed door rolled open with that familiar metallic scrape that sounds the same no matter what year it is. And inside, sitting exactly where it had been parked since spring planting, was a combination most people would have walked past without a second glance. A 1974 International Harvester Farmall 1066 hitched to a 1972 International 82 pull-type combine. The red paint faded into that particular shade that only time can produce, somewhere between rust and memory, and there was no romance in the way Kevin looked at them. No smile, no moment of reflection, just recognition. Like seeing an old tool you know still fits your hand. He'd bought the tractor back in 1989 at an estate auction for $8,500. The combine came with it because the previous owner's son had upgraded and wanted everything gone. And together they'd worked tens of thousands of hours since then. Hours Kevin knew down to the exact number because the hour meter on the 1066 was mechanical. A simple cable-driven dial that never guessed and never lied. He climbed up into the cab, the seat cracked and stiff. The original decal on the side panel half worn away. And when he turned the key, the engine didn't hesitate. It coughed once, caught, and settled into that deep, uneven idle that only a big old diesel makes. The sound of compression and fuel and moving parts doing exactly what they were designed to do, without asking permission from anything else. He stepped back down, walked around to the combine, checked the 10-foot grain platform that was already attached because he'd left it on after cutting a small test patch the week before. It wasn't fancy, no flex head, just a rigid platform with a sickle bar and a reel. But bolted underneath was an old aftermarket floating bar from the 70s. One of those add-ons you don't see much anymore. And Kevin knew without it, he'd be leaving beans on the ground. Small details like that mattered when you were about to lean on equipment everyone said should have been retired decades ago. He pulled the PTO lever on the tractor, felt the engagement through the linkage, watched the shaft spin up to speed, transferring 540 RPM into a system that didn't care about software versions or corrupted files. Belts tightened, chains took load, the cylinder began to turn. The walkers started their steady shake, and by the time the cleaning fan came to life, the machine was in rhythm. Not fast, not impressive, but working. If someone had been watching from the road, they might have thought it looked slow, even inefficient. But what they wouldn't have seen was what mattered most to Kevin in that moment. The fact that everything he needed to make the system run was right there in front of him. Visible, audible, understandable. And when he eased the tractor forward and the header began cutting, beans feeding into the machine for the first time that season, it wasn't nostalgia pushing him onward. It was necessity, and something else too. Something quieter but heavier, the knowledge that whatever happened next, whether the rain came early or the hours ran long, he was the one making the call, not a dealer, not a controller, not a locked screen telling him to wait. By 9:15 that morning, Kevin Hartman was cutting beans, and the contrast between what he was running and what sat idle in the field behind him wasn't lost on him for a second. Because the S780 represented the very best modern agriculture had to offer. And it was parked, silent, waiting for someone else to tell it was allowed to move again. While a pair of machines older than some of the people working at the dealership were already doing the only thing that mattered. Turning time into progress, acre by acre, with no guarantees beyond the ones Kevin could make himself. Once the machine settled into its working rhythm, the field began to change in small, almost unremarkable ways that only someone who has spent a lifetime watching crops disappear, row by row, would notice. The clean line where standing beans ended and stubble began. The faint dust lifting behind the combine and hang low before falling back to earth. The steady, patient movement forward that felt nothing like the rush promised by modern equipment, brochures, but carried with it a different kind of certainty. The kind that comes from knowing exactly what is happening, because you can hear it and feel it instead of reading it off a screen. Kevin kept his eyes moving, not scanning dashboards or data overlays, but checking things the way he always had, listening for changes in engine tone, watching the way the crop fed into the header, glancing back through the small window at the grain tank as it began to fill, not fast, never fast, but evenly. And as the minutes passed, it became clear that this was going to be a long day in the most literal sense of the word. The kind of day measured in hours of attention rather than acres per hour. The International 82 wasn't built to impress anyone. It was built to work behind a tractor that provided power and motion, while the combine itself did the cutting. Threshing, separating, and cleaning, all of it driven through belts and chains you could see and touch. And as the PTO shaft turned and transferred its steady 540 revolutions per minute into the heart of the machine, Kevin found himself falling back into a rhythm he hadn't needed in years, but hadn't forgotten either, adjusting the platform height by feel. Not automation, easing it up when the ground rose, letting it drop when the field dipped, watching the reel pull stalks in without beating them too hard. Knowing that every small decision he made had an immediate, visible effect. There were no alarms, no warnings, no flashing icons telling him something might be wrong. Just the sound of metal doing what metal does when it's under load. And that simplicity carried its own kind of pressure. Because when something went wrong here, there was no system to blame and no one else to call. It would be on him to notice it and fix it. And that responsibility, heavy as it was, felt strangely grounding compared to waiting for permission from a distant technician with a laptop. By mid-morning, the grain tank was filling more often than Kevin would have liked. 60 bushels doesn't go far when the field is yielding around 45 per acre. And every time he pulled up alongside the grain cart and emptied out, he did the math without meaning to. Counting acres in his head, watching the sun climb higher. Feeling the slow burn in his shoulders that comes from holding steady concentration rather than physical strain. At this pace, he was cutting about 4 acres an hour. Maybe a little more if things went perfectly, which they rarely do for long. And the comparison to what the S780 could have done if it had simply lifted its header was unavoidable. Because that machine could have covered this ground in a fraction of the time. Guided itself within inches. Adjusted itself dozens of times a second. Tracked losses Kevin would never see with his own eyes. And as that thought surfaced, it carried with it a sharp edge of frustration. Not because the new machine was bad, but because in this moment it was irrelevant. Reduced to an expensive ornament by a decision it had made without him. Kevin didn't dwell on it for long, because dwelling wastes time. And time was the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. So he focused instead on what he could control. The way the machine sounded, the way the crop behaved. The small adjustments that kept everything moving forward without drama. And as the hours passed, the field slowly shrank behind him. Each acre taken not as a victory, but as progress. And there is a difference between the two when you are racing something you can't see yet, but know is coming. The sun was high when he stopped to eat. A quick sandwich standing beside the tractor, no ceremony. Just fuel for the body while the engine idled nearby. And as he chewed, he looked out across the field again, noticing how still the air was, how the sky carried that flat, pale look that often precedes a weather change days before it arrives. And the thought of Friday night crept back in. Not as panic, but as a deadline quietly ticking away in the background of every decision he made. He thought briefly about the call he'd made that morning, about the calm voice on the other end, of the line explaining service schedules and software updates as if weather and crops were abstract concepts. And he felt a familiar tightening in his chest, not anger exactly, more like the irritation of being reminded that parts of his operation now existed in spaces he couldn't reach, governed by policies that didn't bend for forecast or field conditions. And that thought lingered longer than he liked, because it wasn't really about this one breakdown. It was about a pattern he'd been watching form over years. Machines getting smarter while the people running them were slowly pushed further from the center of the decision-making process. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Kevin had cut 22 acres, the math confirming what his body already knew, that this was slow work, honest work, but slow. And as he made another pass, the repetitive motion began to take on that strange quality where time both stretches and compresses, each minute feeling long while the day itself seemed to move all at once. And in that space, memories have a way of surfacing uninvited. He thought about earlier harvests, about years when equipment was simpler, not because it was old, but because that was all there was. About the first time he'd run this tractor after buying it at auction, learning its sounds, its quirks, the way it responded under load, and how over time it had become less a machine and more a known quantity. Something he trusted not because it was perfect, but because it was predictable. Trust, he realized as he watched the combine work through another row, had become the real dividing line between the two machines sitting on his farm that day. Not age or speed or efficiency, but the question of whether he could count on them when circumstances turned against him. And that realization settled in quietly, without drama, but with weight, because it explained why he hadn't hesitated that morning when he'd opened the shed door. Why starting the old setup hadn't felt like a gamble so much as a return to something solid. The afternoon wore on, the light slowly shifting, shadows lengthening at the edge of the field. And with every pass Kevin became more aware of the physical limits of the system he was running. The narrow header requiring more turns, the small grain tank forcing frequent stops, the constant attention demanded by a machine that would never adjust itself if he wasn't paying close enough attention. And yet, for all of that, there was a strange calm in knowing that nothing here would surprise him. Nothing would suddenly decide it couldn't continue without consulting someone else first. As the sun dipped lower and the air began to cool, Kevin worked until the light finally told him it was time to stop. 12 more acres after 3 o'clock, maybe a little more. A full day by the standards of a system everyone said was obsolete. And when he shut the machine down and climbed off the tractor, the quiet that followed felt earned, not empty. He stood there for a moment, looking at the cut field, the uncut field beyond it. And then, without ceremony, he went through the familiar end-of-day routine, checking belts, looking for anything out of place, making small notes in his head about adjustments he'd make in the morning. Because this wasn't a one-day solution, it was a commitment. One he'd be living with until either the rain came or the field was finished. As he closed the shed door that evening, the S780 still sat where he'd left it that morning, clean, capable, and silent, waiting for a technician and a piece of software to tell it it was allowed to work again. And Kevin didn't look at it with resentment, only with a clear-eyed understanding that in the days ahead, the outcome of this harvest would depend less on how advanced his equipment was and more on how much of the process he could still keep within his own hands. Because for now, at least, the old iron was doing something the new machine couldn't. It was showing up when he needed it, no questions asked. Sometime late that evening, after the light had faded and the machines were quiet again, Kevin sat at the small table in the corner of the shed, the one that had accumulated manuals, bolts, coffee cups, and notes over the years. And he found himself thinking less about acres and more about the shape of the problem he was actually facing. Because the longer he worked with the old setup that day, the clearer it became that this harvest wasn't just about speed or capacity. It was about who got to decide what happened next. The John Deere S780 wasn't broken in any way he could see or touch. There was no twisted metal, no blown hose, no mechanical failure that demanded wrenches or grease. The machine had simply reached a point where it no longer trusted itself, or rather, where the system designed to protect it had decided that continuing wasn't safe. And from an engineering standpoint, Kevin understood that logic. Modern machines are built to prevent damage, to stop small problems from becoming catastrophic ones. But standing in a field with weather closing in, that logic felt abstract, disconnected from the reality of crops that don't wait for software updates. The S780 runs on a network of controllers, sensors feeding data into a central brain that manages everything from header height to hydraulic pressure. And when one of those inputs falls outside an expected range, the system doesn't negotiate. It doesn't ask how important the work is or what the forecast looks like. It locks things down because that's what it was designed to do. And once that happens, there is no lever to pull, no bolt to turn. No workaround Kevin is allowed to attempt, even if he understands the system well enough to know what's wrong. To fix it, you need access, not just physical access to the machine, but digital access to proprietary software that only dealers are licensed to use. Software that costs more than most independent shops could ever justify. Which means the circle of people who can help shrinks to a handful. And if none of them are available, you wait. Kevin had heard people argue about this kind of thing at coffee shops and meetings. The phrase "right to repair" thrown around like a slogan. But until that morning, it had always felt slightly theoretical to him. Something discussed in articles and panels rather than fields and sheds. And now here he was, living inside the argument, watching a perfectly capable machine sit idle because the solution existed somewhere he couldn't reach. He thought back to 1988, a memory that had surfaced earlier in the day and refused to leave. The year his father's main tractor had thrown a rod through the block in the middle of corn planting. A loud, unmistakable failure that left no doubt about what had happened. And the dealer back then had told them it would be days before a replacement engine could arrive. But instead of waiting, his father had made a decision. They pulled the engine themselves on a Sunday afternoon, worked through the night, and by Tuesday morning they were back in the field. Tired but moving, and the memory wasn't romantic. It wasn't framed as some heroic act. It was just what you did when work needed doing, and you had the ability to do it. Kevin knew, even as he thought about it, that if the same thing happened today with a modern tractor, the physical work might still be possible, but the machine wouldn't recognize the new engine without matching serial numbers. The electronic control units would throw fault codes, and no matter how perfectly everything was bolted together, it wouldn't run until someone with the right credentials told it that it was allowed to. And that difference, subtle on paper, felt enormous in practice. The next morning, Kevin was back in the field early. The old tractor firing up the same way it had the day before. Dependable in its predictability, and as he worked, the contrast between the two approaches to machinery grew sharper. Not in terms of which one was better overall, but in terms of which one responded to human judgment. The old system was blunt and demanding. It required attention, it punished neglect, but it also responded immediately to intervention. If something slipped or wore or drifted out of adjustment, you saw it, heard it, fixed it, and moved on. Whereas the modern system was refined and powerful, capable of optimizing itself beyond what any single operator could manage, but only within the boundaries set for it. And once you crossed those boundaries, intentionally or not, you were no longer the decision maker. As the hours added up, Kevin found himself thinking less about the machine he was running and more about the one he wasn't. About the call that would come when the technician finally arrived. About the familiar routine of plugging in diagnostic cables, pulling up fault histories, scrolling through menus filled with parameters and permissions. And he knew how that story would end. The problem would be identified. A corrupted calibration file or a sensor reading that didn't make sense to the system. And the fix would take minutes once the right person was there. But the waiting would still have cost him days he didn't have to spare. By late morning, the sun was high again, the field slowly giving way under the steady progress of the old combine. And Kevin felt the weight of the decision he'd made settle more firmly on his shoulders. Because every acre he cut this way was an acre he wasn't cutting with the speed and efficiency he'd invested in. And yet every acre was also proof that the work could continue without asking anyone else for approval. He checked his phone once, saw no missed calls, no updates from the dealer, and put it back in his pocket without a second glance. Because watching the screen wouldn't make the technician arrive any faster. Around him, the sounds of the machine were constant and reassuring. Belts humming, chains rolling, the engine pulling steadily under load. And in those sounds Kevin heard something he hadn't realized he'd been missing until it was back in his life. A direct connection between action and result, input and output. That didn't pass through layers of abstraction first. The idea that modern equipment could be both a tool and a gatekeeper at the same time had been creeping up on him for years, hidden behind convenience and performance gains, and now, faced with a moment where those gains were unavailable, the cost of that arrangement was impossible to ignore. He wasn't angry at the people who built the machines. He knew the complexity involved, knew the liability concerns, the safety requirements, the sheer amount of data modern agriculture relies on to remain competitive. But he also knew that none of those considerations cared, whether rain was coming or whether beans were at the perfect moisture on a specific week in October. And that disconnect between corporate timelines and natural ones felt like the true fault line running through his operation. As the day wore on, Kevin's thoughts returned again and again to the same question. One he hadn't consciously formed until now, but which sat underneath every pass he made through the field. And that question wasn't whether technology was good or bad. It was whether ownership still meant what he thought it did, because he owned the land. He owned the crop, he owned the machines, at least on paper. But ownership used to come with the assumption that when something went wrong, the responsibility and the authority to address it rested with the same person. And now those two things were drifting apart. By the time afternoon settled in, the wind had picked up slightly, just enough to rustle the uncut beans at the far end of the field. And Kevin felt a flicker of unease, not because the conditions had changed yet, but because he knew how quickly they could. And he wondered how many farmers across the country were watching similar forecasts, running similar calculations, all of them dependent on systems that might or might not cooperate when the pressure was on. The S780 sat where he'd left it. Its presence felt even from a distance. A reminder of what efficiency looked like when everything aligned, and also of what happened when it didn't. And Kevin realized then that this harvest was no longer just a test of equipment. It was a test of philosophy, of whether progress had moved too far toward optimization at the expense of resilience, and whether there was still room in modern farming for tools that answered directly to the people who ran them. As he shut down for the evening, the acres he'd cut that day added to the total. Respectable, but far from finished. And he knew that tomorrow would bring another long stretch of slow, deliberate work. Unless the call finally came and the S780 returned to service, and as he walked back toward the house, boots dusty, shoulders tired, he didn't feel defeated. But he didn't feel reassured either, because the deeper he got into this harvest, the clearer it became that the outcome would hinge not just on weather and effort, but on whether the systems he depended on were designed to serve him when it mattered most, or simply to protect themselves. By the time Thursday morning arrived, Kevin's body had settled into a kind of tired that didn't show up all at once, but made itself known in small negotiations. The stiffness when he climbed into the cab. The way his hands took a second longer to warm around the controls. The dull ache in his lower back that never quite went away, but also never stopped him. And as he started the tractor again and eased back into the field, the numbers were already running quietly in the background of his mind. Acres cut versus acres left, hours of daylight versus days on the forecast. The slow accumulation of progress that felt steady but fragile. Because at 4 acres an hour, any lost time mattered. The routine had become familiar now, almost automatic. Check the belts. Glance at the chains, watch the feed, listen to the engine. Unload more often than he'd like, repeat. And in that repetition, there was both comfort and pressure. Comfort because the system was predictable. Pressure because predictability didn't make it fast. And Kevin knew that every hour he spent in the field this way was an hour he would never get back if the weather turned against him. Mid-morning, the phone in his pocket vibrated. And for a moment his chest tightened. Not with hope exactly, but with readiness. The reflex of someone who knows the call will come eventually. And when he pulled it out and saw the dealer's number, he didn't answer immediately, letting it ring once more as he brought the tractor to a stop. Disengaged the PTO and climbed down, dust settling around him as the machine went quiet. The technician would be there by early afternoon. They said, software update, shouldn't take long. And Kevin thanked them again, because that's still what you say. Even when the solution comes with a reminder of how little control you have over the timing of it. When the service truck finally pulled into the yard, it looked almost out of place against the older equipment. Clean, organized, cables coiled neatly in compartments. A laptop already open before the technician's boots hit the ground. And Kevin watched from a short distance as the familiar ritual began. Panels opened, connectors plugged in. Screens filled with menus and diagnostics that meant nothing unless you had the key to interpret them. And there was no tension between the two men. No argument, just a quiet understanding of roles. One of them trained to operate the system, the other trained to wait. Kevin stood there long enough to see the problem identified. A corrupted calibration file in the header control module. The kind of issue that didn't announce itself with noise or smoke. Just a line of code that didn't line up the way it was supposed to. And when the technician said the fix would take about 15 minutes, Kevin nodded because he already knew that too. He'd known it from the beginning, that the repair itself would be simple once access was granted. And as the software reloaded and the system reset, he felt a familiar mix of relief and resignation settle in. Relief that the machine would run again, resignation at the process required to make it happen. The bill came later, itemized and polite. Emergency call fee, hourly labor, software service charge. The total just under $1,000 before tax. And Kevin didn't argue, not because he thought it was fair, but because arguing wouldn't change anything, and there was still work to do. When the S780 fired up and the header lifted smoothly, responding instantly as if nothing had ever been wrong, Kevin felt the pull of efficiency again. The temptation to switch over immediately and let the machine do what it was built to do. But he looked out toward the field where the old tractor and combine were already in position. Already warmed up, already in rhythm, and he made a decision that surprised even him. He finished out the day with the old setup, not out of stubbornness, but because changing systems midstream felt more disruptive than helpful. And there was something to be said for letting a day end the way it had begun. By evening, the tally stood at just over 200 acres cut with the old equipment. The field noticeably thinner now, progress visible in a way that felt earned. And as Kevin shut things down and walked back toward the house, the sky to the west carried that familiar heaviness that comes before a weather shift. Clouds stacking slowly, not threatening yet, but present. And he knew Friday would be decisive one way or another. That night, sleep came unevenly, not because of anxiety, but because his mind kept returning to the same quiet comparison. The 15-minute fix that had cost days of waiting versus the slow, grinding work that had never stopped once it began. And by the time Friday morning broke, Kevin was already awake, moving through the routine again. Starting engines, checking the sky, feeling the weight of the hours ahead settle into place. The old machine carried him through the morning, through midday, acre after acre, and by late afternoon, the number he'd been working toward finally came into view: 280 acres finished. A significant portion of the field cleared before the rain could make good on its promise. And when he stopped and climbed down, looking back at the cut ground and then ahead at what remained, Kevin felt something close to relief, not because the work was over, but because the worst of the risk had passed. He parked the old tractor and combined back in the shed with the same care he'd always given them, not knowing if they'd be needed again this season, but treating them as if they might. And as the first drops of rain finally began to fall later that evening, light and tentative, Kevin stood at the edge of the yard and watched them darken the dust, knowing that when the field dried enough to finish, he would switch to the S780 and let it run the way it was meant to. Because efficiency still mattered, speed still mattered. But now those things felt like choices again, rather than obligations, and that distinction, subtle as it was, carried more weight than he would have expected just a few days earlier. When the rain finally moved through and left the field behind it, dark and heavy, Kevin waited, not impatiently, just long enough for the ground to firm up again. Because experience had taught him that finishing a harvest wasn't about how fast you could go once everything was ready. It was about knowing when to stop and when to start again without making things worse. By the time he brought the S780 back out to the field, the air had that clean, washed feeling that follows a fall rain, the kind that sharpens sounds and makes distance feel closer. And as he climbed into the cab and powered the machine up, everything responded the way it was supposed to. Screens lighting in sequence, systems checking themselves, the header lifting smoothly at the touch of a control, and there was no bitterness in the moment. No lingering resentment toward the machine or the people who serviced it. Just a quiet acknowledgement that when it worked exceptionally well. Over the next 2 days, the remaining 360 acres fell quickly, long, efficient passes guided with a precision that would have seemed unreal a generation earlier. The machine adjusting itself constantly, maximizing throughput, minimizing loss, turning a task that had once taken weeks into something measured in hours. And Kevin let it do what it did best, because he had never been opposed to progress. Never believed that older automatically meant better. Only that newer sometimes came with conditions you didn't see until they mattered. When the last pass was finished and the field lay bare, the season's work complete, there was no celebration, just a sense of closure. The kind that comes when risk gives way to outcome and the numbers finally stop shifting in your head. Zero crop loss, no weather damage, the harvest saved not by a single machine or decision, but by a sequence of choices that had kept options open when they could easily have narrowed to one. In the days that followed, Kevin went through the same routine he always did at the end of harvest. Changing oil, greasing fittings, topping off fuel, disconnecting batteries, covering intakes and exhausts, small acts of maintenance that felt almost ceremonial in their familiarity. And when he parked the Farmall 1066 and the International 82 back in the shed, he did it without nostalgia, without thinking of them as relics or symbols, just as tools that had done their job when called upon and now waited quietly for the next time they might be needed. The S780 sat nearby, clean and ready as well, a machine that, by every objective measure, outperformed the old setup in nearly every category that mattered on paper. Faster, more efficient, more comfortable. capable of extracting more information from a field than Kevin could ever hope to track on his own. And none of that was in question, not even now. What lingered instead was a smaller, more uncomfortable realization that had taken shape over the course of the week. Not as an argument he could sum up neatly, but as a feeling that surfaced whenever he thought about that first morning in the field. The moment when the header refused to lift and the clock began to matter more than the machinery. The S780 was better, but it was also dependent. Dependent on software, on permissions, on service infrastructure that functioned according to its own priorities. And while that dependency was invisible most of the time, it became decisive the moment something went wrong at exactly the wrong time. The old machines, for all their limitations, had asked less of the world around them. They required fuel, oil, attention, and labor. And in return, they offered a kind of autonomy that Kevin hadn't realized was becoming rare until it was suddenly indispensable. He didn't see this as a rejection of modern farming or a call to turn back the clock, because he knew better than anyone that agriculture had always evolved, that every generation had faced its own version of this tension between new capabilities and new constraints. But he also knew that something fundamental shifted when the ability to act was separated from the responsibility to act, when ownership no longer guaranteed authority in moments that demanded immediate judgment. In a very real sense, Kevin owned his land outright, owned his old machines completely, could fix them, modify them, run them until the frames cracked if he chose, and that ownership was uncomplicated. It didn't require passwords or permissions or approved tools. It existed in the physical world where effort translated directly into outcome. The S780, on the other hand, existed partly in that same world and partly in another one. A digital space governed by rules he didn't write and couldn't override. And while his name was on the title and his payments were current, the boundaries of what he was allowed to do with the machine were drawn elsewhere, by people and systems that didn't see the weather rolling in or feel the pressure of beans standing at perfect moisture, standing in the quiet of the shed after everything was put away. Kevin didn't frame these thoughts as a grievance or a political position. He framed them as a practical assessment, the kind you make after something has tested your assumptions and left you with evidence you can't ignore. He knew he would continue to use advanced equipment, continue to invest in technology that made sense, because efficiency and scale were not optional in modern farming. But he also knew now, with a clarity that hadn't existed before, why he would never let go of the older machines entirely. Why having a backup that didn't require permission to operate mattered more than the spreadsheet suggested. The harvest of 2023 would be remembered as a success by most conventional measures. The crop brought in, the losses avoided, the machinery functioning as intended by the end. But for Kevin, it marked something quieter and more lasting. A shift in how he understood the relationship between himself and the tools he depended on. A recognition that resilience didn't always look like optimization, and that sometimes the most valuable feature a machine could offer was not speed or intelligence, but the simple assurance that when you turned the key and pushed forward, it would answer to you. As winter settled in and the fields lay dormant, the machines waited, old and new alike. And Kevin didn't know which ones he would need first come next season. He hoped it would be the ones that promised ease and efficiency. But he took comfort in knowing that if circumstances demanded something else, if timing and weather and systems collided again, he still had an option that placed the final decision where he believed it belonged, in the hands of the person standing in the field, looking at the crop, weighing the risk, and choosing to move forward.